My cousin Eddie yelling that out there. You'll get your $10, Eddie. It was almost 15 years ago now that John Maxwell, who's right down in the front row, is one of my very close friends these days, but John called me and tried to coax me into teaming up with him to do a conference on the subject of leadership. I'd never done such a thing before, and I was not too excited about teaming up with John and doing this conference for two reasons. First was, I was such an activistic personality at that point in my life, I didn't want to waste time talking about leadership. I just wanted to lead. In those days, leading Willow felt like riding on a rocket, and I didn't want to give up 3 days at Mach 2 to have a fireside chat with a bunch of pastors. But there was a second reason why I kept declining John's gracious invitation. And that is, I lacked the one thing that every good conference talk needs. And that was content. I'd been leading Willow for over 15 years and yet had never really sat down and reflected on my own leadership. I hadn't read much on the subject of leadership. So truth be told, I had absolutely nothing to say about it. I knew I could lead. I knew God had entrusted me with this Romans 12:8 gift of leadership. But I just didn't know how or why I was able to lead. And eventually I caved in to John's persuasive powers, mainly because of our friendship. I agreed to do the conference. And then that forced me for the first time to reflect and read and to come up with something to say about leadership. And I put a talk together called The 5 I Believes. I'll give you the 5 points of that first talk 15 years back. Here they are. I believe the local church is the most leadership-intensive enterprise in society. That was my first conviction. The local church is the most leadership-intensive enterprise in society. I believe it's harder to lead a local church well than it is to lead any other enterprise in society. Why? Because the church is utterly altruistic. You know, you're trying to help people relate to an invisible God that they don't have interest in relating to. Try that sometime. It's utterly altruistic, this whole thing. There's not monetary gain involved. There's a lot of service and suffering and hardship involved in this whole thing. It's altruistic, and secondly, it happens mostly through volunteers. Most of us in leadership want to lead through people we can pay and sort of control. You can't do that in church work. My second point in that talk was I believe there's a spiritual gift of leadership. Some people have it and some people don't. It was a very unpopular point in that talk because a lot of people found out they don't have that gift and they need to move on and find the gift they do have. Others found they did have that gift and they needed to develop it, and I think that's why you're here. Third point was, I believe that most churches unintentionally undermine the expression of the leadership gift. 15 years ago, most church governance systems were layers of bureaucracy to protect the church from a leader. And the church paid. The church paid. Now, I believe in a plurality of leadership. I believe that there should be a community of leaders. And so, but I think a lot of churches undermine the expression of the leadership gift because they don't want people with strong leadership gifts to have the freedom to lead. I think that's changing by God's grace. Fourth, I believe that most people love to be led. If they're led by a Christ-like leader, I believe most people love to be led. And finally, fifth point of that talk, I believe the local church is the hope of the world. And its future rests primarily in the hands of its leaders. That was the time in my life where I concluded that the local church really is the hope of the world. Government cannot solve our problems ultimately. Business can't. Education can't. There's something wrong with the human soul that only the power of Christ can cure. And the church has that message to steward. So I gave that talk the first time, and then I was invited to give it hundreds of times. First just around the United States and then all around the world. And God used that talk to arouse curiosity amongst church leaders so that when we started the summit 10 years ago, there were sufficient numbers of people ready to hear more. From that point, I went on to describe the functions of leadership, because I think there are functions that all leaders must do. If you're a leader, you do the following kinds of things. You cast vision. That is, you paint a picture of the future that produces passion in people. Leaders build teams. They inspire and motivate the team. Leaders lead change. They establish core values. They allocate resources. They intercept entropy. They find what's not going well. They name it, label it, and fix it. And leaders develop emerging leaders. It takes a leader to develop another leader. So there are all those functions of leadership, and I've been writing about those and talking about those for over 15 years now. But in the last couple of years, I have been vexed about a question pertaining to leadership. A question that vexed me so much, it almost became an obsession in my life. And the only way I could frame the question was to ask it this way: what precedes vision? In leadership settings, we always put vision as the top of the list, at the top of the list. Vision is the most potent weapon in the leader's arsenal. And I wanted to ask the question, what happens inside a leader that is so powerful that it eventually gives birth to a vision at a later point in time? That question started to really work its way into my psyche. We've all been cheering on Billy Graham these past few months as he spoke to hundreds of thousands of people in the New York City area at what has been called his last crusade. Billy has been filling stadiums for almost 60 years. He's had a burning vision to help people all over the world understand the power and the love of Jesus Christ. But my question was this: what happened inside of Billy before he held his first crusade? What happened inside Billy Graham's heart that was so powerful, so incendiary, that it eventually gave birth to the vision of filling stadiums with people who needed to know about Christ? What happened that was so powerful that he went out and rented that first stadium? I reasoned to myself, whatever that experience was, that must have been something. And I went on this assumption that there's some powerful firestorm experience in the lives of most people that sort of forces them into leadership, forces them to birth a vision that then they can act on. So I've been thinking about this, obsessed with it. And one day I'm trudging my way through the book of Exodus, just doing my daily Bible reading, which I strongly recommend for every leader. You think I'm kidding? Read your Bible every day. Just read your Bible every day. Doesn't have to be long, just read it every day. And I was reading through the Old Testament book of Exodus. I came across the story of Moses, one of the great leaders in antiquity. And I believe I discovered the defining experience that forced Moses into leadership, whether he wanted to lead or not. I think it was his firestorm experience. Let me just refer to the account. If you brought a Bible, it's in Exodus chapter 2. Verse 11 says this: one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. Side note, just for context. Moses was a Hebrew, a Jew. He had been raised in Egypt by the Pharaoh's daughter. He was accustomed to the wealth and the privilege and education that accompanied that Egyptian upbringing. But he was not an Egyptian again. He was a Jew. The text says that one day he went out to see his own people. His own people. They were involved in hard labor. Most of you know that the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites, worked them mercilessly, had them making bricks in the midday sun and so. So back to the text in verse 11 again. While Moses is watching the hard labor, the daily oppression of his own people, he sees an Egyptian soldier, we think, beating one of his own people, beating a Hebrew. Now let me ask you a question. It's not a pleasant one. When's the last time you ever really saw